The secret behind the old homestead's door, the young wife pregnant by her 80-year-old father-in-law. This tragic story begins in a quiet corner of America's heartland, a place where family, honor, and tradition are still an invisible, yet unbreakable, tether binding every soul. It was a story cultivated by loneliness, watered by clumsy gestures of care, and left to bloom into a forbidden fruit that no one dared to taste until the horrifying secret was finally exposed, sending an entire family spiraling into ruin. Ethan was a structural engineer. When his company sent him to Japan for a 14-month collaborative project, his young wife, 23-year-old Hana, stayed behind in the old family farmhouse with his father, Arthur. Arthur was nearly 80, a widower for many years, who lived a solitary life in the moss-covered home at the edge of town. The house was so quiet, the only sounds were the chirping of birds at dawn, and the rustle of wind through the branches of the great oak in the backyard each night. Initially, the lives of Hana and her father-in-law were like two parallel lines, one young, one old, two people from entirely different worlds, forced to coexist under one roof. Hana was a gentle woman who loved her husband deeply. She stayed behind to shoulder his duty of caring for his elderly father, tending to every meal and medication, cleaning every corner of a house already filled with the memories of a bygone era. Arthur, long accustomed to his solitude, kept a deliberate distance from his daughter-in-law at first. But time, along with Hannah's quiet and devoted care, slowly began to erode the icy shell around his heart. The first month passed in near silence. Arthur rarely spoke to Hana beyond brief words of thanks or dry instructions. And yet, her gentle presence was quietly seeping into the cracks of his life. One afternoon, she brought a steaming bowl of homemade chicken soup to his room. She said nothing, simply placing it on his nightstand and waiting quietly for him to finish before clearing the dish. As she turned to leave, he spoke softly. "Hana, you don't have to go to all this trouble." Hana paused at the door, not turning around. A small smile touched her lips as she replied, "It's what Ethan's wife should be doing, sir." His name on her lips, spoken with such simple duty, left Arthur stunned. That night, he sat for a long time by the window, an indescribable feeling welling up inside him. How long had it been since this house had felt the warmth of a woman's touch? Since the smell of hot soup had wafted from the kitchen? One rainy afternoon, as Hana was sweeping the old flagstone patio, her foot slipped. The loud thud of her fall startled Arthur from the book he was reading inside. He rushed out in a panic. Seeing her on the wet stones, he didn't hesitate for a second, scooping her up into his arms and carrying her back into the house as the rain began to fall harder. Hana was too shocked to react, aware only of the circle of his arms trembling slightly with age, yet surprisingly strong. When he gently placed her on her bed, their eyes met. The moment was brief, yet it stretched for an eternity, a deep, silent gaze that shattered the invisible wall between them. That night, Hana tossed and turned, unable to sleep. It wasn't fear or resentment she felt, but a profound confusion, a strange flutter in her chest she had never experienced before. From that day on, Arthur began to see Hana through a different lens. It was no longer the simple gaze of a father-in-law. Hidden within it was a special concern, an unnamable stirring. He told himself to keep his distance. He had lived his entire life as an upright man, a man of principle who had taught generations of students about morality and dignity. But the more his reason tried, the more his aging heart betrayed him. The feeling of her soft body in his arms that day had awakened desires he thought had died long ago. As for Hana, she couldn't understand her own emotions. Every time she saw Arthur's thin, stooped figure sitting pensively on the porch, her heart ached with a deep compassion. She felt for his loneliness, for the hollow look in his eyes when he stared into the distance, as if waiting for an echo from the past. Some evenings, she would brew a pot of hot tea and bring it out to the porch, sitting in silence beside him. They said nothing, simply sharing the quiet of the night. Once, he spoke softly. "Ethan's mother used to love drinking tea like this." For the first time, Hana saw not the usual sternness in his eyes, but a simmering, unquenchable grief. Unconsciously, she placed her hand over his wrinkled one in a small gesture of comfort. And he did not pull away. That clumsy but meaningful touch in the quiet night became an invisible milestone, dividing their lives into a before and an after. The silence between them was no longer mere awkwardness. It was now tinged with confusion and an unspoken longing. That evening, the sharp ring of the telephone shattered the thick atmosphere. It was Ethan, calling from Japan. Hana answered hesitantly, forcing a bright smile into her voice to hide the turmoil in her heart. Ethan chatted away, oblivious, telling her about his work on site, his colleagues, and how terribly he missed home. "Is Dad doing okay at home?" he asked. Hana stared into the empty space in front of her, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Dad is doing fine." She didn't dare say more, terrified that with just one more word, Ethan would hear the strangeness in her voice and know that something was terribly wrong. Another day, while Arthur was sitting on the porch reading the newspaper, Hana brought out a cup of hot tea. She set it on the table and was about to turn away when he called out softly, "Hana, sit with me." She hesitated for a moment before taking the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a long time. He turned the pages of the paper, but his eyes weren't focused on the words. Hana kept her head down, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Suddenly, he asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Are you afraid of me?" Hana flinched, quickly shaking her head. "No, sir, I just don't know how to act." He looked at her, his eyes as deep and still as an autumn lake. "Neither do I." His words were a confession, an acknowledgement of the invisible thread that was tightening around them both. That night, Hana opened her diary again. She wrote, "Every day, I tell myself I have to forget his eyes, forget the warmth of his hand. But the more I try to forget, the more I remember. I know I'm Ethan's wife, but my heart has never beat this wildly before." Before the ink could dry, she snapped the book shut. Outside, the old maple branches groaned in the wind, a sign of the coming storm. During the third month of Ethan's absence, the storm finally broke. One afternoon, the sky turned dark, and rain began to pour down in sheets, as if trying to wash everything away. As Hana was rushing to pull the laundry in from the line, the power went out. The entire house was plunged into a damp darkness. She fumbled for the old oil lamp, lit the flickering flame, and then, as if by instinct, walked toward Arthur's room. The door was slightly ajar. He was sitting silently on the edge of his bed, holding a faded yellowed photograph of himself with his late wife. Hana started to turn away, but he called her back. "Come in, child, the wind is fierce." She stepped inside, placing the oil lamp on the table. In the pale, wavering light, his face looked even more haggard. "I miss her so much," he said quietly. Hana didn't reply. She just sat down beside him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of silent comfort. He turned to look at her, a long, searching gaze, his eyes holding a sky full of memories, of loss, and of loneliness. Hana didn't understand why she didn't pull her hand back. She only knew that her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a strange, deep stirring. The moment stretched into an eternity, until Arthur slowly placed his hand over hers, his fingers gently closing around it. "Hana." It was the first time he had said her name without child attached to it. She looked up, their eyes meeting, with no more avoidance. The distance between them from a shoulder to an embrace was not far. But to cross it was to cross a line from which there would be no return. And that night, the screaming rain outside became a curtain for a sin that could never be washed away. The next morning, Hana rose earlier than usual, though she had barely slept. She moved like a shadow, terrified of making a sound. The kitchen was cold. Her hands trembled as she measured out the coffee grounds. Something inside her had shattered, but the pieces weren't sharp. They created a dull, endless ache. Arthur didn't come out for breakfast. He locked himself in his room for the entire day. Hana left a tray of food outside his door, knocked softly, and walked away. He finally emerged in the late afternoon. He didn't look at her, walking straight to his familiar stone bench under the maple tree. He sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. That evening, dinner was served, but neither of them touched their food. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "We can't let this go any further." Hana looked up, her eyes red, but her gaze was unwavering. "I didn't mean for it to happen. But I can't pretend that it didn't." He squeezed his eyes shut, his thin shoulders trembling. After a moment, he stood up and disappeared back into his room. Hana knew that once the door to the heart had been opened, no one had the strength to close it again. That night, Ethan called. His face, thinner but still bright, lit up the phone screen. "You look pale lately," he said cheerfully. You need to eat properly, okay? Hana forced a smile, a twisted expression devoid of any feeling. Yes, everything's fine here. After the call, she stood for a long time in front of the old, tarnished mirror. Her skin was sallow, her eyes were sunken. But what terrified her most was that she no longer saw the reflection of a wife, faithfully waiting for her husband. All she saw was a traitor, trying desperately to hide her own sin. The first person to notice the strangeness in the house wasn't one of the people living it, but Brenda, a widowed neighbor whose house was just next door. One morning, just as the sun was rising, Brenda happened to see a peculiar sight. Hana, still in a thin silk nightgown, was carrying a glass of warm water into Arthur's room. She set the glass down, said something, and then they both laughed. That laugh, shared between a longtime widower and his young, vibrant daughter-in-law, made Brenda narrow her eyes. She said nothing, but a seed of suspicion had been planted. That evening, Brenda came over for a glass of iced tea. Her eyes darted back and forth before she let a seemingly innocent comment slip. With your husband so far away, you must miss him terribly, Hana. Hana just nodded with a strained smile. Brenda pressed on, her eyes flicking toward Arthur. Just the two of you here. But you seem to get along so well. It's nice to see a father and daughter-in-law so close. Arthur, who was about to take a bite of his food, froze. His fork clattered onto his plate. Hana flinched and quickly bent down to pick it up. No one said another word, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than 1,000 words. After that day, the rumors began to spread through the town, starting as hushed whispers but growing sharper and more venomous by the day. That Hana seems sweet, but I bet there's more to her than meets the eye. Arthur's old, but it seems he's still got some fire in him. Hana overheard the words from the man at the butcher shop. She pretended not to notice, but her throat tightened. That night, she wrote in her diary, I've done nothing wrong, and yet I can't prove my innocence, because the feelings I'm hiding, they are entirely real. One afternoon, as Hana was hanging laundry, Arthur came outside. We have to stop this, he said quietly. Hana turned her face away, not answering. At that exact moment, the first drop of rain of the season fell on the back of her hand, as cold as a slap of reality. Her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. His voice was cheerful. What are you doing, honey? Hana stared out at the empty yard and answered slowly. I'm at home, but I don't think I'm inside myself anymore. Rumors are invisible, but their power to wound is terrifying. One afternoon, Hana went to the market to buy vegetables. The moment she arrived, she felt the atmosphere shift. A few women who had been clustered together, talking, fell silent. They avoided her gaze, each busying herself with some task. But as she turned to leave, a voice carried intentionally, not too loud, but loud enough for her to hear. It's bad enough to disrespect the living, but to disrespect the dead, that's a whole other story. Hana made it home. Her hands and feet still trembling. She didn't cry. She just felt an invisible hand squeezing the air from her lungs. That afternoon, Arthur returned from a long walk in town, his face grim. The rumors had clearly reached him there too. He said nothing, simply disappearing into his room and sitting in silence for a long time. That night, for the first time, Hana dreamed of her mother-in-law, the woman she had never met. In the dream, she stood at the foot of the bed, not scolding, just weeping silently. The next morning, Hana was burning with a high fever. She lay delirious in bed. Arthur rushed to bring her cool water and press a damp cloth to her forehead. They didn't speak, but his tender care only made her inner torment worse. When the fever broke, she said softly, Maybe I should go away for a while. Arthur wasn't surprised. He just nodded slowly. I was thinking the same thing. They both understood that only distance could extinguish this sinful flame. But at that exact moment, the phone rang again. It was Ethan. In her exhaustion, Hana had forgotten to turn off the speakerphone. His voice boomed, crystal clear, into the silent room. Honey, I've got great news. The company is giving me 2 weeks leave. I've already booked my ticket. I'll be home next week. Hana froze. Arthur stood stunned. No one could speak. The old farmhouse suddenly felt too small, too suffocating to contain 3 people and a truth that could not be buried forever. For 3 days after Ethan's return, everything in the house seemed normal on the surface. Hana cooked, cleaned, and smiled at all the right moments. Arthur read his books in the morning and watered his plants in the afternoon. And Ethan, He simply watched it all in silence. He didn't interrogate or snap at her, but his every glance, every seemingly random question, made Hana feel as if she were being stripped of her defenses, layer by layer. "Were you on the porch when I called the other day? I thought you said you were inside. Dinner's a little salty tonight. Did you make it the same way you always do?" Each time, Hana would answer smoothly, but her throat felt as dry as if she were swallowing sandpaper. She felt like a caged bird trying to appear calm while a hawk watched its every move. That evening, while Hana was in the shower, Ethan walked over to the glass cabinet in the living room where the old family photo was kept. He picked up the frame, pretending to dust it. But then he noticed something strange. On the glass, there was a faint smudge, 2 fingerprints, one large and one small, pressed closely together. It was a trivial detail, but it was enough to plant a monstrous seed of doubt in his mind. He began to recall other oddities. The pillow on his father's bed had been flipped to the other side. His father's bedroom window, once always shut tight, was now often left cracked open at night. And most importantly, there was the look in Hana's eyes. Whenever Arthur was near, the way she looked at him was not the way a daughter-in-law looks at her father. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay perfectly still, his back to his wife. The next morning, as soon as Hana left for the market, he acted. He took out a tiny security camera, the kind he used to monitor his construction sites, and secretly installed it in the corner of a bookshelf, aimed directly at the hallway connecting his room to his father's. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He only knew that if he didn't get to the bottom of it, he would go mad. When Hana returned, she froze. She noticed the photo frame on the cabinet had been moved. A flash of panic flickered in her eyes. She knew. Ethan had begun to follow the faint footprints she and his father had left behind. On the 4th night after the camera was installed, Ethan sat in his room, headphones on, his eyes glued to his phone screen. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a steady drizzle that matched the beat of a heart awaiting judgment. And then, the image on the screen made his own heart feel as if it were being squeezed in a vice. Arthur opened his bedroom door and stepped out. Hana emerged from the room next to his, carrying a glass of warm water. It was a fleeting moment, but it was brutally clear. As they passed in the hall, Arthur placed a hand on Hana's shoulder. She turned, and their eyes locked. No words were spoken, no gesture crossed a physical line. But that single look, it transcended every boundary of morality. Ethan paused the video. He had no concrete proof of an affair, but a husband's intuition told him that something had happened between them. Something unnatural. The next morning, he was a different man. The smiles were gone. When he looked at his wife, there was no longer any tenderness, only cold, methodical scrutiny. Arthur noticed the change. One afternoon, as father and son were having tea, he asked, "Is there something you want to ask me, son?" Ethan looked at his father for a long time before speaking one dry, hollow sentence. "I think you and my wife were once too close." Arthur didn't deny it. He just lowered his head, the hand pouring the tea trembling slightly. "Some things should never have happened," he said slowly. "But if you had been home, maybe things would have been different." That night, Hana was sick in the bathroom. Ethan heard her retching. But he didn't go in. He just stood outside, leaning his back against the wall. His fists clenched. A thought, insane yet razor-sharp, flashed through his mind. If she's pregnant, is the baby even mine? The next morning, while Hana was still asleep, he quietly entered the bathroom. He pulled a few strands of her hair from her brush, carefully folded them in a piece of paper, and slipped it into his pocket. He caught the earliest bus to the city and found a private diagnostics center. He requested a prenatal paternity test between a fetus and its paternal grandfather, registered anonymously. When he returned, it was late afternoon. Hana was sitting on the porch. She looked up when she saw him, but her gaze couldn't seem to reach him anymore. An invisible, bottomless abyss had opened up between them. "I'm tired. Don't wake me," was all he said before walking straight into their room. Hana nodded, but tears began to stream down her face the moment his back was turned. 3 days passed in a heavy, feverish haze. Every morning, Hana woke up in a state of panic, no longer knowing what she was living for. Arthur grew more and more silent, his expression eerily calm, as if he were a condemned man waiting for his own execution. That afternoon, Ethan received a phone call. He didn't tell anyone what it was about, just quietly changed his shirt and left in his car. Hana watched him go from the window, her body trembling. She didn't dare ask where he was going, because she already knew the answer. He returned just as dusk was settling. In his hand was a plain white envelope, unmarked except for a red seal. He tore it open, read it once, then folded the paper back up. There was no screaming, no smashing of furniture. He just collapsed into a chair, staring blankly out at the yard, his hand squeezing the paper until it was a tight, wrinkled ball. Hana crept forward, standing behind his chair. You know, don't you? Ethan didn't turn around. His voice was low and thick like clay. Yes. A sob escaped Hannah's lips, and the air rushed out of her lungs. I didn't mean to. Ethan let out a laugh, a sound more painful than 1,000 screams. You didn't mean to? Do you have any idea how much I dreamed of holding this child in my arms the day I booked my ticket home? He stood up and handed her the paper. Hana read it, her hands shaking, her vision blurring. It was the DNA test result, confirming the paternal relationship between Arthur and the fetus in her womb. The flimsy piece of paper became a razor, severing the final thread connecting the three of them. Ethan turned and began to pack his suitcase. Hana rushed after him, grabbing his arm. Where are you going? I don't know. He wouldn't look at her. I just know I can't breathe in this house anymore. I'm begging you, just let me explain. I've been listening to your lies for a year. He spun around, his eyes bloodshot. Now, just leave me alone. He grabbed the handle of his suitcase and walked decisively out the door. On the porch, Arthur was already waiting. Ethan stopped, looking his father straight in the face. The eyes of the two men, one young, one old, locked. You've killed this family, Dad, Ethan said softly. But I'm not sure who the most pitiful one is among the three of us. He walked away, disappearing into the darkness. And for the first time in her life, Hana saw Arthur collapse. He didn't kneel because of old age, but because the weight of his sin had finally crushed a once proud man. A week after Ethan left, the rumor spread like wildfire. Ethan's mother, Margaret, who lived in the city, heard the news and drove through the night, arriving at their gate at 4 a.m. When Hana opened the door, she saw a thin woman whose eyes were blazing with fire. How dare you still show your face in this house, she hissed. Hana collapsed to her knees. Margaret didn't even step inside. She pulled out a stack of papers, a copy of the DNA results. I don't know what kind of black magic you used to seduce him, but that thing in your belly is a stain on this entire family. Arthur hid behind the door, not daring to come out. He heard every word, every venomous hiss, from the woman he had once shared a bed with. From that day on, the relatives began to arrive. Some demanded Hana get an abortion. Others discussed selling the house and putting Arthur in a nursing home. Hana sat in the middle of the room, her hands wrapped around her belly, saying nothing. The public didn't kill her with a knife, but with their cruel, unblinking stares. The store in town refused to sell her groceries. Children threw stones at the gate as they passed, chanting taunts about a bastard child. That night, Arthur gathered the last of his savings, placed it in front of Hana's door with a small note. Go, child. I can't keep you here, but I want you to keep the baby. As the sun rose, Hana packed a few clothes. She didn't look at Arthur, didn't say goodbye to anyone. Alone, with her large, pregnant belly, she quietly pushed open the wooden gate and walked away. The gate that had once led her to a new life was now the gate that pushed her into a bottomless abyss. Brenda, the neighbor, watched her go and muttered to the person beside her. Where can you go to escape that kind of shame? Hana heard her, but she didn't look back. Hana rented a tiny room, less than 100 square feet, in a small town 30 miles from her old home. Here, no one knew who she was, no one called her name with contempt. The room was damp, the plaster peeling from the walls. But at least here, she didn't have to face any scrutinizing eyes. She used the money Arthur had given her sparingly, eating instant noodles every day, drinking the cheapest milk, and finding a job washing dishes at a small diner at the end of the alley. The owner, a woman in her 40s, looked at Hana's growing belly and sighed, but then she nodded. Well, just work as long as you can. I won't ask about your private life. She worked during the day, and at night, she wrote in her diary. The lines she had once used to describe a secret love were now words of self-reassurance, helping her not to fall apart. She wrote for herself, for the child in her womb, and for the two men who had pushed her into this tragedy. My child. I no longer know if I am the sinner or the victim. But if the whole world turns its back on me, I will still have you." The baby grew. Back pain tormented her every night, and her feet swelled up. One day, while carrying a bowl of soup to a customer, she suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed. The diner owner rushed to help her up, urging her to see a doctor, but Hana just shook her head. She had no papers, no insurance. She was terrified that if she went to a hospital, someone would recognize her. One evening, on her way back from the diner, a sharp, cramping pain seized her. Her belly tightened like a drum. Every step felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She managed to drag herself back to her room before collapsing on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "My baby," she sobbed, "please don't leave me." Her neighbor, a solitary old man, heard the thud and rushed over. Seeing her on the floor, he frantically called for an ambulance. Hana woke up after hours of unconsciousness in a small community clinic. The doctor told her she had suffered a severe placental abruption. If she hadn't been brought in when she was, both mother and child would have been lost. She needed absolute rest and could not do any heavy work. Hana didn't dare ask about the bill. She knew that by tomorrow, she would have no money, no job, and no place to live. But when the nurse brought in a bowl of broth, she froze. Arthur was sitting by her bed. He looked as if he had aged 10 years. His hair and stubble were completely white, his clothes were disheveled, but the way he looked at her was the look of a father. There was no more desire, only guilt and remorse. Hana burst into tears. "Dad, how did you find me here?" He didn't answer, just quietly pulled a pair of tiny white baby socks from his pocket and placed them in her hand. "You don't have to forgive me," he said softly. Just save my grandchild." 3 days later, Arthur rented another small room right next to the clinic to better care for her. He cooked her meals, washed her clothes, doing everything a father would for his sick daughter. The silence between them was no longer a cover for their secret, but the only thing keeping them from shattering completely. Meanwhile, Ethan had returned to their hometown. The inferno of his anger had burned out, leaving only a terrifying, cold resolve. He met with a lawyer and asked 2 questions. First, could he sue for full custody of the baby after it was born? Second, could he press charges against his father for incest? The lawyer's answers were disappointing. A lawsuit would be incredibly complex, as Hana was a consenting adult and there was no proof of coercion. But Ethan would not give up. He had to face them one last time. It was dusk when Ethan found the small rental complex. He knocked on the door. It creaked open, and Hana stood there, thin and pale, her pregnant belly now large and obvious. Behind her, Arthur sat silently in a wooden chair. The 3 of them, once again in the same frame, but no longer a family. "What do you want?" Hana asked, her voice hoarse. Ethan pulled a document from his pocket. "I'm not going to sue you, and I'm not going to sue him. But the baby. I'm raising the baby." Hana was speechless. You're going to take my child from me?" Ethan nodded. Arthur coughed loudly and stood up. "Ethan, I won't let you do this." Ethan spun around. "You no longer have any rights here, Dad. Your whole life you taught me about morality, and then you were the one to trample all over it." Arthur bowed his head, offering no defense. Hana clutched her belly and backed away. "Get out, I'm not signing anything." "Then we'll see each other in court," Ethan said, and turned to leave. 2 weeks later, Hana received a court summons. Her child wasn't even born yet, but its fate, and hers, was about to be decided. That night, Arthur went to a pharmacy, bought a pen, and sat up writing all night. The next morning, he went to the free legal aid office at the local senior center. He placed a signed statement on the desk. "My name is Arthur Hayes, and I am the one who committed this sin. I accept full responsibility. I willingly surrender all my assets and will accept any punishment. I only ask the court not to take away her right to be a mother." When Hana found out, she was stunned. She read the copy of the statement Arthur had left on the table, her whole body shaking. "Are you insane?" she cried out. He just shook his head, his voice weary. "I'm just trying to atone for my mistake. Not to be forgiven, but so you can keep your child." That night, in the cold, sparse room, for the first time since everything had happened, Hana hugged him. The embrace no longer held the sinful tremor of before, only the shared sorrow of 2 people trapped in the same tragedy. "You don't have to save me like this," she said through her sobs. Just don't leave me alone again." A week later, Hana went into labor, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The contractions came hard and fast in the middle of a torrential downpour. She was rushed into the delivery room in critical condition, her blood pressure plummeting, showing signs of preeclampsia. The doctor was blunt: they had to perform an emergency C-section. Out in the hallway, a trembling Arthur signed the consent forms. Then he collapsed into a chair, bowing his head as if in prayer, though he had never believed in any god his entire life. The surgery lasted for more than 2 hours. When the operating room doors finally opened, the cry of a newborn baby echoed down the hall, a sound so small yet so clear, it felt like the only note of salvation in a world full of condemnation. Hana was exhausted, but when the nurse placed the baby on her chest, she smiled. For the first time in all those months, she smiled not because the pain was over, not because she had been forgiven, but because she was holding a tiny, innocent soul in her arms. The custody hearing took place on a crisp, early autumn morning. The air in the small courtroom was stretched as tight as a wire. Ethan sat alone on the plaintiff's bench, his gaze ice cold. Hana walked in slowly, holding her infant daughter, with Arthur, his silver head bowed, by her side. Ethan's lawyer presented a sharp argument. Hana had a history of mental instability. She lacked the financial means to raise a child. And most importantly, a child born of a morally reprehensible relationship would suffer severe psychological damage if left in the mother's care. Hana's legal aid attorney countered that no one had the right to tear a child from its mother's arms simply because of her past. The judge allowed the parties to speak. Ethan stood, his voice cold. "You don't deserve to be a mother. I can't be her father, but I can give her a normal family. One without a squalid past." Hana clutched her daughter tighter. "You want to rip her away from me to erase a stain from your own heart. But what about me? You helped create that stain with your absence." The room fell silent. At that moment, Arthur asked for permission to rise. His voice was hoarse. "I am the one most at fault. I do not ask for forgiveness, but I beg the court not to take away the last thing this girl has left. This child is a part of her mother's soul." After 15 minutes of deliberation, the judge read the final verdict. The court granted full custody and care of the child to Miss Hana Miller. Ethan was granted unrestricted visitation rights. There were, the judge concluded, insufficient grounds to terminate her sacred maternal rights. Hana held her baby and broke down, sobbing with relief. Ethan said nothing, just turned and walked silently out of the courtroom. Arthur collapsed back into his seat and let out a long, shuddering breath, as if a weight he had carried his entire life had finally been lifted from his shoulders. 3 months after the trial, Hana moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, secretly bought for her by Arthur with the last of his savings. He didn't stay with her. He only left behind a handwritten letter and an old wooden box. "I am leaving, but not to run away. I want you to be able to live a life without constantly looking over your shoulder. My daughter. If you cannot forgive me, then please do not forget to forgive yourself." The next morning, Hana went to the county records office to get a birth certificate for her child. For the father's name, she left the line blank. For her daughter's name, she wrote, Serena. Because after everything, the only thing she truly wished for her child was peace. A year later, Ethan sent a birthday gift. It was a small, hand-knitted wool doll, with no note attached. Hana looked at it for a long time before quietly putting it away. There was no more hate, no more anger. She took her daughter to Arthur's grave and placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the cool stone. She sat there for a long time, telling her child about a grandfather who had made a terrible mistake, but who had also loved so very truly. The wind rustled through the trees, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. And in Hana's heart, for the first time after everything, there was no longer sin, only life, sprouting anew. Thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Your support means the world to us.